Apart from New Zealand, Fish and Chips Australia has another official name. Aotearoa is the name given to the islands by the indigenous Maori population. With its emphasis on cricket, rugby and fish and chips, it's easy to see the cultural influences of the British on New Zealand. While the first Europeans to discover it were Dutch, Frisians even, the first scrum was decisively won by the Maori, and the Dutch decided it wasn't quite for them and didn't engage with it any further. But apart from the British and the Dutch, many other Europeans would come to call the islands of Aotearoa home. Referred to in English simply as the North Island and the South Island, the Maori names for the landmasses of New Zealand are rather more fun. The most popular legend describes how the hero Maui fished up the entire North Island using a magic fish hook and caught an enormous fish, Hahau Whenua, which became the North Island. Its Maori name, Te Ika a Maui, means the fish of Maui. Maori on the North Island traditionally call the South Island Te Waka a Maui, Maui's canoe. But these aren't the only islands. Some 30 kilometres south of the South Island is another archipelago, the main island of which, in the same naming scheme, is called Te Punga o Te Waka a Maui, the anchor of Maui's canoe. In English, it's called Stewart Island, named for Captain William Stewart, a Scottish whaler and sealer whose ship visited in 1809. Visit Stewart Island, or Rakiura, another more popular Maori name for it today, and you'll see plenty of traces of both Maori and British people in the island's history. And yet, traces of a third important group lie just beneath the surface. Some of the first European inhabitants were of Orcadian and Shetlandic descent, having been sought after as fishermen due to the belief that they were inured to chill winds and unforgiving soil and thus could run a successful fishery where others might not. As with William Stewart, many of the first Europeans on the islands were hunting seals and whales for their fur and oil respectively. Of these, some of the most intrepid were Norwegians. Familiar with whaling in their own icebound northern shores, Norwegian whalers also plied the southern seas from the second half of the 19th century. Eager to invest in skilled Scandinavian maritime expertise, in 1922 the New South Wales government gave a licence to Captain Carl Anton Larsen to whale in the Ross Sea, situated between New Zealand and Antarctica. Born Norwegian, Larsen had learnt English training in Britain and then become a British citizen. A legendary polar explorer, his ventures to the far south allowed him to claim the record of being the first person to ski in Antarctica and had the Larsen ice shelf named after him. Starting in 1924, Larsen and 2 factory ships supported by 5 chasers established a whaling station on Stewart Island in Patterson Inlet. This became the Kaipipi shipyard and became a hub of activity over the next decade, hosting a large workshop, a blacksmith, several shops and a jetty to a floating wharf made of an old whaler from the mid-19th century called the Othello. After becoming active in 1928, Larsen's crews would process some 9,000 whales on 9 expeditions to the Antarctic during the summer. All those dead whales produced about 1.5 million tons of oil. In the winter, the men had various jobs. Some were engineers, liaising with the boatsmen about what had to be repaired and manufactured. The most dangerous job belonged to the diver, ensconced in a suit protruded by pipes. He had to check the hulls of the chasers for damage, and the southern seas were a rough place. In 1927, one of the chasers, Chaser Star 4, was almost lost when she struck an ice floe and started to sink. The pumps were unable to contend with the water that was streaming in, and it was feared she would be lost. But with the help of 2 other chasers, the ship was emptied and winched onto the much larger mothership, being saved after 12 nail-biting hours. Several whalers were not so lucky. The bodies of the deceased were pickled in their coffins to be taken back to Norway upon the completion of the whaling missions. The larger factory ships were the Sir James Clark Ross, for whom the Ross Sea had been named, and the C.A. Larsen, named after the captain of the expedition. These ships left Norway at the end of August, sometimes stopping in Wellington in the North Island or Port Chalmers in the South Island, before arriving on Stewart Island to take on men and supplies from the station in Patterson Inlet before continuing on. From there they would meet with the fleet in the Antarctic in the Ross Sea and return with the oil. The entire fleet would come back to Stewart Island in February or March, where they would be met by many people from the island. Most of the whalers arrived aboard the Sir James Clark Ross in 1924 at the start of the mission. As well as Norwegians, a large number of Swedes also manned the whaling ships departing from Stewart Island, which in total made around 40 whalers at any one time. That might not sound like a lot, but on an island with perhaps around 200 or 300 inhabitants, that was quite significant. And the arrival of these non-English speaking foreigners on the island did come as a bit of a shock at first. But with time, the familiarity did grow, oiled by the economic boost the Scandinavians provided the islanders. Islanders from the time remembered the Norwegians celebrating 17. Mai, Norwegian Constitution Day, on the 17th of May each year. That day they would play with the children on the beach in the capital Oban, and ended in the evening with a dance at the only hotel on the island. And it probably didn't just end with dancing either, as at least some 13 of the 40-man Scandinavian crew married islanders. That means quite a few of today's Stewart Islanders have Scandinavian blood running through their veins. Most years, some 20-odd islanders would also sign on with the Norwegian envoy on the mainland in Bluff to join the Scandinavian expedition to the far south. This helped to forge ties between the whalers and the natives, many of those signing on being fully or partially of Maori descent, as well as including some people from the southern coast of the South Island. Captain Larsen also ingratiated himself with the local population by designing and building a new fishing vessel for Bill Thompson called the MV Ranui, working on it for 3 years, where he bunked with a local fisherman as he built both the boat and a house for himself at Port Pegasus. When MV Ranui was finished, some 40 villagers turned out to watch, and as one of the children of the Scandinavian whalers, Olga Sonsom, recalls, Graham, Gladys Lewis's little Scotty dog, was the only one who got a drink of champagne at the launching. When Gladys broke the bottle on Ranui's bow, everyone cheered, but Graham was busy licking up the champagne as to the matter born. Unfortunately for the Scandinavians, but luckily for the whales, the Great Depression was a death knell for Stewart Island's Norwegian whalers. The peak whaling season of 1929 to 1930 was an omen of what was to come. A record expansion of the industry coincided with the economic depression. New whaling ships were being built, but the demand for them disappeared, at least for some time. In 1930 to 31, the Ross Sea was visited by 3 whaling expeditions, N.T. Nielsen Alonso, Cosmos, and the new Sir James Clark Ross, a ship of the same modern design as Cosmos. This technological transformation was of little avail to the industry in the short run. The following season, 1931 to 32, most of the whaling fleet was laid up, and in 32 to 33, only one expedition returned to the Ross Sea, the Sir James Clark Ross. The Antarctic whaling industry resumed in the mid and late 1930s, but elsewhere than in the Ross Sea. But for the Scandinavians operating out of Patterson Inlet with their whaling licence from the British government, there was no coming back. In New Zealand, the whaling company's operations were considered an evasion of the rules. The licence system did not work as envisaged, and the New Zealand government ended up having almost no income from whaling. A general political opposition to whaling developed that culminated in the passing of the Whale Industry Act in 1935, where remaining whaling licences were cancelled, and further whaling in the Ross Dependency was stopped. While the Stewart Island operation had been stopped, that didn't mean that the ships and the crews didn't stop having adventures. Originally built on Tyneside at the famed Newcastle shipyard of Swan Hunter, the C.A. Larsen would have the closest call of its life in Norwegian waters. Requisitioned by the Kriegsmarine in 1940 to service the Kirkenes station in Arctic Norway, she was sunk by the RAF in a raid on Tirpitz in 1944. Having survived antipodal ice and British bombs, she was salvaged and refitted as the Antarctic, back in Norwegian service, putting to sea once again to continue whaling for another 8 years in the Arctic Sea before finally being scrapped in 1954. With a changing world and changing attitudes to whaling and its sustainability, the Norwegians never returned to Stewart Island. The ones that left, in any case, those that stayed and married the local population, slowly became Kiwis, and their descendants can still be found both on and off the island in New Zealand today. Most of the Lutheran Norwegians and Swedes attended the Presbyterian Church on top of the hill in Oban. If you visit today, you'll be greeted with both the New Zealand and the Norwegian flag inside. The list of the congregation's names from the 1970s features several Scandinavians, though today non-denominational services are only held once a month on the island due to the decrease in churchgoers. Another clue as to the fates of the Scandinavian whalers and their descendants is on the several war memorials on the island. With an Oskerud, Kostensen, Jensen, Nielsen and 2 Tolsens, it appears a quarter of those from the island who served abroad in the Second World War were likely of Scandinavian descent. Today, it's the odd surname, a Hansen room in the local pub that serves as reminders of the Scandinavian past. The site of the former shipyard on Patterson Inlet now only hosts some rusty propellers, once the powerhouses that drove the chaser ships after the mighty leviathans of the Southern Sea. Several of the snekker, that is traditional wooden rowing boats used by the whalers, still bob up and down in the harbours of Stewart Island, like the recently refurbished Else. So that's the story of New Zealand's Norwegian island. Even though it wasn't really Norwegian, it's still interesting that people from Norway and from Sweden came to this island in fairly significant numbers at one point in the 1920s and 1930s. Let me know in the comments below, did you know about the Norwegian whaling expeditions to the Antarctic, and did you know that many of them stayed behind in New Zealand to this day? If you'd like to see any more videos about the history of New Zealand, it's something I've been quite interested in, and I'd like to explore some other topics, potentially some earlier topics too, to do with the New Zealand Wars, or the quite sizable Dutch migration to New Zealand as well as of course the fact that Dutch people were the first Europeans to arrive. There's also incredibly interesting pre-European history in New Zealand with the arrival and the development of the Maori culture. So let me know what you'd like to see in the comments below. Until the next time, I'm Hilbert, and this is The History.